Oh man, the amount of times that I get asked, should I upgrade to the new ZV-E1 or should I get the FX30? Or, I've got the FX30, should I change to this? That is a massive question. I get asked maybe 3-4 times on my Instagram per day. And then obviously YouTube comments, they're just like, which one? Can you do a comparison? So here we are. We're going to be doing a comparison, but it's kind of like comparing apples and sandwiches. They're very different cameras because it's full frame APS-C, but it's also professional and it's also vlogger. There's so much we need to unpack in this video. We're going to be talking about some of the specs and pretty much who these are tailored for. And hopefully that will give you a little bit more of an insight to which one is actually going to be best in your situation. That is the key thing, in your situation. So let's get into it. So right off the bat, the ZV-E1 is the newest full frame camera from Sony. This is the 12 megapixel sensor that's pretty much out of the A7S III and FX3. So this thing is absolutely stacked with image quality and features, and it can give you 4K up to 60 frames per second in full frame. And then later in a firmware update, they're actually going to be given 4K 120 frames per second, which is about a 10% crop. Whereas this is a 26 megapixel APS-C sensor, and this will give you 4K up to 60 frames per second in APS-C. But then if you go to 120, it actually crops in an extra 1.5/1.6 times. And essentially you're just going to be punched in on that same lens. So realistically, when it comes to those kind of specs, you would obviously have to give a tick to the ZV-E1 because it is full frame. You have 4K 60, you also have 4K 120 when it comes to obviously that firmware update, and there's less of a crop, whereas this one does crop in a lot. And because the FX30 does crop in on the sensor, it is a little bit noisier as well. So you do obviously have to worry about that image quality there. Now this is a full frame camera, so that means you have to obviously use full frame lenses, which full frame lenses tend to be a little bit more expensive, and the G Master lenses they're not slugs. They are incredible lenses, and you have a massive amount of lenses that you can use with this one. But being APS-C, you can use those full frame lenses on your APS-C without having any vignetting. So that is a massive pro with the FX30. And in saying that, you can use obviously the APS-C sensors on here. Whereas if you try the APS-C sensors on here, you're going to get massive vignetting around the corners. If not, you're going to get a big circle literally in the middle of the sensor. So that's a massive pro for the FX30. Now, I guess the only con with that one is that this is APS-C, so you do need to consider if you need wide angle lenses, you have to go really wide. But Sony do have that new 11mm lens, which is obviously great for real estate videography. But, this one has 12mm lenses, 14mm lenses in full frame, so you're going to get a little bit wider. You just obviously have to try and search around for wider lenses for your APS-C cameras in that situation. Now, in saying that, if you do switch over to 1080p, you can actually utilize Super 35 crop mode with this, but obviously you are in 1080p, but a lot of people still film in 1080p, and it actually has half decent 1080p quality anyway. Now, they both have clear image zoom, and they also both have that zoom rocker on the front, which you can program to utilize that clear image zoom or utilize that zoom rocker for obviously those power zoom lenses. But when it comes to that image quality, clear image zoom obviously is great on the ZV-E1, but it's even better on the FX30 because this is a 6K sensor that downsamples to 4K. So you got a little bit more data and a little bit more information on that sensor to obviously have that clear image zoom / digital crop. Whereas this one is only a 12 megapixel sensor, and when it comes down to recording, it's about a 10.2 effective megapixels. So there isn't as much information and crispiness when it comes to that footage. Now, when it comes to that LCD screen, this one does have a 1.04 million dots LCD, which, isn't great. But hey, you're not watching films on the back of this thing. It doesn't really need to be incredibly high quality. And a lot of people complain because they want that, 2.36 million dot or 3 million dot or 4 million dot screen. I'm not fast. I really don't care. As long as I can see my framing and composition, I'm all G. It's all good. But when it comes to obviously professional filmmaking, that's probably when you're going to be using an external monitor that's got to have a little bit more resolution, a little bit more size. And that's where you can actually see when it comes to, you know, having things in focus, your framing and composition a little bit better. But if you're just comparing these two together, this one does have a better back screen. It has a 2.36 million dots LCD screen. But we have to talk about, if you do want an external monitor, this is a full-size HDMI, whereas this one, I've already broken a micro HDMI, which is annoying. It's the first micro HDMI I've ever broken, but full-size HDMI for the win. Now, if we're on the features on the side, well, you know, this one's a little bit tough because it's got one SD card slot, not even Type A card, it's just an SD card. So that kind of does cripple this a little bit, whereas this one has dual card slots, but they're also both CF Express Type A or SD cards. So you're going to be able to utilize redundant recording if you do want to do weddings and all those kind of things that you want to have redundant recording, or even just you're recording into one, fills up, it spills over into the second card. So that is really great. But hey, you're a vlogger, you're probably only going to be using single SD card slot anyway. So, you know, the FX30 obviously does win there. Now this one is interesting because this is Sony's first 4K 30 frames per second streaming camera, whereas the A7 IV only has 4K at 15 frames per second when you're streaming for Zoom and all those kind of things, which I use all the time, but I just use 1080p. This one's got 4K 30, but I did some overheating tests and it's a little bit interesting. You can watch the overheating video and that's pretty interesting. You do have to take that into consideration, but definitely is a little bit better than the FX30 when it comes to streaming. But we have to talk about, like I said, overheating. This one has a fan and this one doesn't. It's a smaller body, it's going to be generating a lot of heat, and yes, it does overheat. This one has an internal fan, so it's active cooling. It pretty much doesn't overheat. It doesn't overheat. It's got a fan. It's built for longer record times. That's what this thing is designed for. A professional camera, longer record times. This one, short bursts, content creators, vloggers, those kind of things. So it does overheat. So a massive, massive win goes to the FX30 here, because if your camera overheats, it's pretty much a brick. It's dead weight. This one won't overheat, so you're going to have massive assurance that this is going to last through a professional shoot. And speaking of professional features, this one does RAW externally through to the Atomos Ninja 5, so that could be massive for some people. I mean, I never use RAW recording anyway, but you know, that feature is there if you do want that. And also it does have that CINE EI picture profile, which, you know, some people absolutely love. I use absolutely all the time. I pretty much just throw it into CINE EI, which allows you to use just the two dual base, which is 800 and 2500, whereas this one has still got S-Log3, which is great, and you can just obviously have flexible ISO, which is perfectly fine if that suits your workflow. But the biggest thing about that one is that the second base is a lot higher. This is 640 and 12,800. So this one is going to be an absolute low light beast, whereas 2,500 isn't exactly high, but it is actually very, very usable, because 2500 is actually a really good level if you just want a little bit more than that 800, and it's going to clean up a little bit and give you the same amount of dynamic range, or at least similar amount of dynamic range as the first base, whereas this one is very high at 12,800. So some people actually, if you get into, you know, ISO 6000, that kind of level, they'll switch it into second base and put an ND filter on the front, and you actually start getting better results than obviously having it at 6000. Now the FX30 did just get Anamorphic de-squeeze, and that obviously is really good because I love using the Sirui anamorphic lenses with this one. They only have 1.3 and 2 times anamorphic squeeze, but the APS-C lenses are a 1.33 times anamorphic squeeze, so it actually de-squeezes it for you on that display, so it doesn't look all warped and weird, and that is a really good feature, and I absolutely love that, whereas this one obviously doesn't have that feature. Now, another one of the newest update, this one has DCI 4K, which is 4096 by 2160 in terms of the pixels that you're actually getting, whereas regular UHD is 3840 by 2160. So this has obviously regular UHD. This one now has DCI 4K, but they both shoot in all-eye codec, which is amazing, and the image quality is fabulous out of these two when it comes to that. And they also both have H.265, which is your XAVC HS codec as well, if you want some really smaller files without losing much of the image quality. Now this one does have timecode in as well, so if you are on set and you want to jam a timecode directly in here or out of here, you can do that with this one, whereas this one, what even is timecode with this one? That's a win right here. Now, more professional things. This one is fully weather sealed, which is amazing. The build quality on this thing is phenomenal because it's pretty much the same as the FX3, whereas this one, it's only dust and water resistant. Whereas if you look at this microphone at the top, if you get water into that, yeah, you're gonna have some pretty big problems. So for all my 80s friends out there, this is like a gremlin. Yeah, you put water on it. Now, while we're on that topic of audio, this one obviously does have better inbuilt audio. So you can actually customize this to have the audio to pick up from ortho in the front or, you know, from behind or omnidirectional. It really depends. This one, internally audio, is not that great. It gets you by. But you're able to put that top handle on that you've pretty much bought it with, and it gives you 24-bit audio, and it gives you professional XLR inputs and another 3.5 audio jack and a nice, obviously, handle, shock mount on the top. Yeah, whereas this one, you still have that multi-interface hot shoe, which they both have. So you can put the ECM B10 or ECM B1M in there as well. But in terms of just the audio internally by themselves, the ZV-E1 actually wins there. Now, while we're talking on the body, this one has a whole bunch of mounts on there, whereas obviously this one hasn't. It's just a recycled plastic design, magnesium alloy, really solid design. So for a professional standpoint, this one is a big win, and this one kind of feels like a toy, but hey, don't drop it. Just look after your gear and don't drop it. Now, while we're on the build design, this one actually does have that little control nipple right here. Believe it or not, it's actually quite handy if you do some flexible autofocus points and stuff and moving things around. It's quite handy. This one doesn't have it. And obviously, this has a whole bunch more custom buttons on here. So if you do love custom buttons, trying to put a whole bunch of, you know, custom features in there, this one's got it with that record button on the front, which is super handy. Whereas there's obviously less buttons on here. Very simplified, which is obviously their point of making it like this. So this one obviously is better because there's more options. This one, less options, but more plain. Now, we obviously have to talk about stills, and I know these are both video cameras first, but they still both take stills, and this one's a 26 megapixel camera, and it takes 26 megapixel stills, but it only takes it in single shot, so you can't actually do burst mode, which kind of sucks because this would make a pretty decent photography camera. Whereas this one's a 12 megapixel sensor, gets 12 megapixel stills, but you can actually do burst mode, 10 frames per second in burst, which is pretty handy if, you know, you're photographing sports and wildlife, all those kind of things. But it's really tough to give the check mark to either of them because 26 megapixels gives you more room for cropping. But this one has burst mode, so burst mode could be extremely useful for you. So yeah, I have to leave that one up to you guys. Now, in terms of dynamic range, 15 stops of dynamic range, and this one has 14 stops of dynamic range. I mean, it's much of a muchness. It's very, very similar when it comes to the image quality, but obviously this one does have that higher amount of dynamic range, and it has that beautiful sensor from the A7S III, FX3, FX6, so you know you're going to get really amazing image quality performance from the ZV-E1, but in saying that, the FX30 is no slouch. It does absolutely incredible when it comes to dynamic range and image quality performance. And speaking of the sensors, this one does have better rolling shutter performance, 8.7 milliseconds, whereas this one is about 15 milliseconds. So if you are whipping the camera side to side, you're going to get better performance from the ZV-E1 over the FX30. Now we're going to move on to some of the specs where, yeah, the ZV-E1 is going to be blowing the FX30 out of the water because the new features in here, the autofocus system. This has the autofocus system out of the A7R5. Now that has a separate AI processor which the FX30 doesn't have, and you're going to be able to target, you know, planes, trains, cars, birds, animals, all those kind of things. You're going to be getting more autofocus performance out of the ZV-E1. And then we have to talk about auto framing in this as well. So auto framing is that new thing where you pretty much just set it down and you can choose the size of the frame, small, medium, or large, and it will literally just crop in for you, make it look like someone's filming you. That's how cool this thing is, and that is a really cool feature. Obviously the FX30 doesn't have that. And something that's very similar to auto framing is image stabilizer. So this essentially, auto framing, it's kind of like auto framing when moving. So essentially you can lock onto a subject, walk with them, keep them right side of the frame, and essentially just walk next to them, and it'll keep them nice and stabilized while keeping them in that side of the frame as well, which is phenomenal. This also has intelligent auto mode, which essentially, if you have one person in frame talking to the camera, second person steps into the frame, essentially it's going to adjust that depth of field to accommodate for that second person to keep them in focus. So it'll pretty much bring it from an f1.4 all the way to like an f11, and then jack up that ISO and maybe drop the shutter speed down a little bit, just so you're both in focus, which is pretty cool if you do only shoot auto, and that would suit the people who actually use this camera. Now the product showcase mode is in this one, it was in the ZV-E10 as well. It's in a custom button, which is down the bottom here. Essentially, if you just hold something up, it's going to focus on it without blocking your face. So if I hold this up right here, you can see I'm still tracked and I'm still in focus because it thinks I've pretty much told it to focus on my eye and not focus on this. But if you block the eye, that's how you can show the products. But this one, you can essentially press that button, hold it up in front, and it'll just focus on here, then back to here. So much of a muchness, it really depends on if that's going to suit you, but obviously big check mark for the ZV-E1 for having that. Now this one does have inbuilt video time-lapse, which is similar to the S&Q mode, which is generally in all the Sony cameras. You can actually do 1 frame per second, which kind of gives you a video time-lapse, but you kind of have to give the check mark to the ZV-E1 because it's got that newest feature in there anyway. Now it does have a nice quick menu screen on the front, and I do like it. You can swipe it away or swipe it back in, and gives you a few different options there with, you know, autofocus. I mean, it's gives you a little bit more option there, or you can customize your function button to have some more there. Just gives you more options. So obviously that is great that it has that, and hopefully they're going to be rolling that out in all Sony cameras from now on. Okay, so the price. This is $1,798 US, whereas this is $2,198 US. So there is a price difference between these two. This full frame camera happens to be about $400 US more than the FX30. So you have to take that into massive consideration. If you are on a budget, $400 could be a lot. And then if you're buying APS-C lenses, they're generally cheaper than full frame lenses. So you're going to be able to get more value out of an APS-C camera than you would as a full frame camera, but it really depends on what you're going to be actually utilizing them for, and does APS-C matter over full frame? So now we have to break it down. Which one is better? And like I said, we are literally comparing apples and sandwiches. They're that different. It's really hard to compare these directly, but we still can compare the image quality, the specs. But you have to understand, who are these for? This one is designed and marketed towards content creators and vloggers, whereas this one is designed and marketed towards filmmakers and professional videographers who want to make as much money as they possibly can, or best art as possibly can with their camera. And this one is probably going to be suited, obviously, towards professional videographers, filmmakers, and all those kind of people, whereas this one obviously is suited towards vloggers and content creators. But in saying that, that doesn't mean you can't use this for professional filmmaking and content creation. And in saying that, that doesn't mean you can't be a content creator or a vlogger using the FX30. So it really just depends on what features you feel like you need the most. But if you have the FX30, there is absolutely no reason why you would buy the ZV-E1, because this is a damn good camera. It is an absolute jam-packed camera, and Sony actually made this extremely good. And they actually cut into the FX3 sales because of this camera was so good. People were actually buying this more than the FX3, and that's kind of a crappy thing for them because they make more money with the FX3, but hey, they produced an amazing camera with majority of things that most people will be doing in terms of content creation, YouTube, Instagram. The ZV-E1 is probably going to be more than enough camera, whereas the FX30 obviously is already more than enough camera. We are so lucky to have these cameras available to us these days because they are incredible. You do have to understand the limitations of being, you know, a Super 35 sensor, APS-C sensor. So you're going to need to worry about that crop. Whereas this one, it overheats, and you obviously have to worry about that. That's an interesting factor and a pretty big factor if you want to do long record times. If you want to do long record times, this is your go. When it comes to sports and wildlife, it's very similar, much of a muchness. When it comes to photography, very similar again. Just try and understand the pros and cons and apply it to your own work. But what do you guys think? Which one do you think is better? Which one are you going to choose? Do you already have the FX30? Have you already put your order down for the ZV-E1? Let me know in the comments below. I'd really love to know your thoughts. Yeah, thanks for watching. And if you liked this video, give me a thumbs up. That'd be amazing. And I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.